Let's bring in Mark Leibovich. He's a CBS News political contributor and chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine. And Mark, during the transition, it seemed like President Trump might end up having some kind of relationship with President Obama. Now it appears that is not the case. What is your sense on where the president is going for counsel on some of the major issues he's facing?
Well, I have no idea where he's going for counsel. I mean, that's sort of, when John asked the question, I mean, it immediately became an Obama question. I think one of the really interesting things about being in the very small fraternity that is the President's Club is that you have a very, very small but kind of rarefied group of people that have been there, right? And, a lot of them are dead, but there are a few who are alive. And, I think George W. Bush and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, I mean, I think there's been a tradition, at least recently, of at least predecessors offering counsel to the people who come after them. From what President Trump said, it sounds like not a lot. There's not much of a relationship going forward, since he's become president. It sounds actually outright hostile given how the conversation went. But yeah, I mean, we all know the history. I don't think President Trump was pinning the hopes of his presidency on a good relationship with his predecessor or the counsel of his predecessor.
One of the things that John also pushed him on was his assertion that Barack Obama wiretapped Trump Tower, and he's still pretty much clinging to it, and he said that his side had been proven very strongly. What do you make of that? Because he wouldn't clarify what he meant when John sort of pushed him a little.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that story has moved forward at all. I mean, that's basically where we were, on that fateful Saturday morning when he tweeted that President Obama was a sick and bad guy and that he wiretapped him. And, look, he's been pressed repeatedly. His aides have been pressed repeatedly. People, Republicans up and down the Hill have been pressed repeatedly. They haven't really substantiated anything. He really didn't move the ball forward yesterday. So, look, I don't know if he ended the interview abruptly because he just wants to avoid this as a topic again. There's actually some serious business to conduct this week. And, when that issue flared up the first time, it did suck a lot of oxygen out of the White House, and it really did take a lot of conversation for a number of days. But yeah, I really have no idea what he was talking about then. And he wasn't very specific at all, obviously.
Mark, Congress, as you know, agreed to a $1 trillion budget deal last night, and some of Mr. Trump's key policies are not included. So what can we read into how that process unfolded?
I think what we can read is that all parties basically concluded that they don't want to fight over this. I don't think it's a good look for anyone right now to have a government shutdown, especially at a moment when the White House is looking to get really the first definitive legislative victory. Republicans on the Hill are looking to actually get something assertive done on either health care or taxes or something. And I think this clearly is not. I mean, it looks, if you look at the details, there's probably something in it for everyone. I mean, there's not a border wall. There's no there's no Planned Parenthood cuts from what I can tell. So that's a win for Democrats. The White House, Republicans get a military, increased military funding, increased border security funding. So they could see that as a win. It did look like no one really wanted to have this fight right now.
The president also says that a new health care bill is on the way and that he told John Dickerson that people with pre-existing coverage will be covered. He was very clear about that. But I'm wondering, what kind of party-wide support does that provision have?
Well, I mean, it has pretty widespread support if you look at, the broader population. The question is something like that going to be a deal breaker with the, very conservative elements of the Republican caucus, namely the Freedom Caucus, that, negotiated the deal. I mean, that could be a deal breaker conceivably. It's also confusing about whether, the president was actually reflecting anything that was really in the bill. So, that could potentially blow up the bill if, in fact, he's giving information to the Freedom Caucus, for instance, that has been something averse to what they were led to believe before.
All right, Mark, let's talk about North Korea. The administration continues to talk tough, but the president has seemed almost sympathetic in recent days when talking about the leader, Kim Jong-un. He called him a smart cookie in his interview with John. What do you make of the rhetoric over the past couple of days?
Yeah, I wouldn't call that sympathetic necessarily. I mean, that just sort of strikes me as that's how President Trump talks. I mean, I think he was kind of talking off the top of his head. I mean, I don't think he was rendering any sort of great character judgment or let alone policy judgment on how he's going to proceed. I mean, the fact is it's a very tense situation. It's one where the status quo, for better or worse, has worked for pretty much everyone for a number of decades, except for North Korea. So, I mean, no one obviously wants this to escalate any further. My sense from listening to that was that there was not a lot of hard thinking behind it, and I wouldn't sort of take it as a softening of his position at all in North Korea.
Let's talk about the fact that the president invited the president of the Philippines to the White House, Rodrigo Duterte. This is a guy whose administration so far has killed thousands of people in its war on drugs. I think the police there actually admit to killing about 2,000 people in self-defense. Like, the numbers are outrageous. Many groups around the world say he has violated civil rights across the board in many different ways. What sort of message is this administration sending by inviting him to the White House?
Well, it's certainly part of a pattern. I mean, if you look, I mean, he talked about a very warm conversation he had with President Erdogan of Turkey last week. Obviously, Vladimir Putin, I mean, the history is a little more checkered recently, but he talked a lot about, wanting to have better relations there. It is part of a pattern. I think the question is, they seem to have reached the conclusion that this is not something that their base cares about. It's not something that a lot of Republicans on the Hill have really spoken up very much about. I mean, there's been some, but it hasn't really, hindered any kind of legislative action at all, or helped it for that matter. So, I would say it's troubling. I mean, I think, it's part of a pattern. I wouldn't look into it beyond that, except that, look, this is a bunch of, pretty sympathetic words for actors that have been pretty, as you mentioned, very harsh in the past.
Yeah, and the administration sort of said, hey, this relationship might be able to help us with North Korea, but I wasn't aware of the Philippines having any particular influence on North Korea.
Yeah, no, I wasn't either. I'm not sure what he meant by that.
Right. Short and sweet.
Short and sweet, yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
I think probably a lot of people feel the same way you do, Mark. Mark Leibovich of the New York Times Magazine, as always, my friend, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.